Hello everyone, now we begin in a courtroom where the air is stiff with impatience, the kind that sits in pressed suits and polished shoes, thumbing phones and muttering legal jargon. You can almost smell the coffee breath and condescension. A man walks in, not with swagger, not with legal counsel, not even with a hint of doubt. He's older, built like granite, and carries a manila folder tucked under one arm like it weighs more than it should. His boots squeak on the linoleum. His hair is cropped close, silver now. A few people stifle laughs. Some don't bother hiding their smirks. You probably won't survive this kind of humiliation if you've never been underestimated in public, if you've never had a room full of people decide you were irrelevant before you'd said a single word. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. Now, relax, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get into today's story. The veteran's name is James Holleran, though nobody bothered to look at the case docket long enough to remember that. They just saw an older man, alone, representing himself in a civil case involving property and back pay from a government job that clearly wanted him to go away quietly. The court bailiff gives him a second glance, but doesn't offer help. The judge barely raises her eyes. The opposing counsel, two men and a woman in matching navy suits, whisper like middle schoolers passing notes. James takes a seat at the petitioner's table. He places the folder gently in front of him, unfolds his hands, and waits. A thin crack runs up the back of his hand, the kind of scar that's too precise to be random. But no one's looking closely enough to see that. Not yet. They mock his opening statement. It's short. Too short. The kind that doesn't come with citations or footnotes. Just facts. Just events. Just a man describing a contract breach, a forced early retirement, and a pension that stopped arriving without explanation. The defense chuckles. The judge raises her brow, makes a note, "This isn't your average unemployment case," one of the lawyers sneers during a recess. "You sure you don't want to settle?" James doesn't reply. Instead, he opens the manila folder, thumb through the papers, and you can see his mouth move silently, reading the same line again and again. Not because he's nervous, but because he's making sure it's still true. That it still lines up. That the weight of it hasn't shifted in the retelling. People whisper things. That he's stubborn. That he's wasting the court's time. That he probably watches old war movies and thinks he's still in them. The phrase shell-shocked gets tossed around casually, like it's funny. Like it's not a decades-old wound that still pulses when the lights are too bright, but one person doesn't laugh. A janitor, maybe mid-30s, leans on a mop and watches James from the corner of the room. Watches how he folds his notes just so. How his back never touches the chair. How he carries silence like a shield. There's something about that posture. That tension. The janitor narrows his eyes, like a memory is tugging at the edge of his mind. Back in court, the defense presents flashy exhibits. Charts. Emails. Signed affidavits. They lean on protocol. Bureaucracy. The kind of stuff that buries people like James. But he's still calm. He listens to all of it, blinking slowly, like he's back in some jungle waiting for movement in the leaves. Finally, the judge turns to him. "Mr. Holleran, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we recess for lunch?" He stands. Smooth, controlled. Not a single rustle from his chair. He picks up the folder, walks to the front, and sets it down on the witness table. Opens it, and pulls out a tarnished silver medal. For a second, just a second, the courtroom doesn't understand what they're looking at. But then the janitor stops mopping. The opposing counsel stop whispering. The judge leans forward. James says nothing. He just sets the silver star down. Not for drama. Not for pity. Just because it's part of the story, and now, finally, people start to listen. That's the moment when the temperature in the courtroom drops 10 degrees. Not because someone raised their voice or slammed their fist, but because reality just shoved its way in, wearing combat boots. This isn't some crank trying to squeeze money out of the government. This is a man who walked into hell and made it out. Who earned that medal not from a general's favor, but from blood and silence and split-second decisions that saved lives. And now, he's here. Not for honor. Not for revenge. But because after everything he gave, someone still decided he was disposable, and now, they're about to find out he's not. The medal lay there like a weight, less a symbol, more a question that demanded answering. The courtroom, moments before filled with procedural chatter and passive mockery, now sat in a hush so complete it felt sacred. You could almost hear people swallowing their pride. The judge, still silent, finally said, "Mr. Holleran, can you explain the relevance of this item?" But James didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked down at the silver star, ran one finger over its etched surface. You could tell he wasn't thinking of the courtroom. Not anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. It's 1970. Vietnam. A heat that doesn't forgive, a jungle that devours light. James is 22, built lean, skin sunburned raw, jaw clenched like it's the only thing keeping his insides from spilling out. His platoon had been ambushed in a valley near Quang Tri province. 3 men down. Radio silence. No medevac in sight. He wasn't the ranking officer. But he was the only one still moving. In the hours that followed, James did what no one expected. He pulled 2 wounded men to safety, using a stream bed as cover. He organized a counter-ambush with the remaining soldiers. He held position, alone, behind enemy lines for 11 hours, repelling 2 attacks. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found James half-conscious, his rifle barrel glowing hot, with 6 confirmed kills and no casualties among the wounded. For that, they pinned the silver star to his chest. Back in the courtroom, you can see the moment when the judge makes the connection. Her lips part slightly. One of the attorneys shuffles his papers just to fill the silence. But nothing fills it. Not really. Because now they're not looking at an old guy defending himself. They're looking at a man who stared death in the face and didn't blink. James finally speaks. This isn't about the medal. It's about what came after. And what came after, you realize, was no ticker tape parade. He came back to a country that didn't know what to do with its veterans. A government job, civil service, was supposed to be the transition. Respectable. Safe. But slowly, subtly, they nudged him out. Denied promotions. Changed department policies mid-cycle. Reassigned him from leadership roles to desk work. When he raised objections, they said it was performance-related. When he requested documentation, it got lost. The final insult. Early retirement, disguised as restructuring. His pension, already modest, was recalculated with a new formula. Suddenly, decades of service meant nothing. James isn't here for a fortune. He's here because they erased his name from the books like it never mattered. Like his past, and everything he bled for, could be reduced to a clerical oversight. And you know what's strange? The courtroom starts to shift. Not with applause. Not with outbursts. Just, attention. You see it in body language. The way people start leaning forward. The way pens stop scribbling, because what James just revealed is bigger than his case. He's every veteran who got dropped into a 9-to-5 world where their discipline became intimidation, their straightforwardness became insubordination, and their trauma became a liability. The defense lawyer, Briggs, the slickest of the 3, tries to reassert control. Mr. Holleran, with all due respect, we're here about employment contracts. Not war stories. James doesn't even look at him. With all due respect, he says quietly, my employment began the moment I took an oath. It didn't end when the war did. It lands hard, now, the janitor from earlier. He steps away from his mop. Makes his way to the back of the courtroom. Doesn't say anything. Just watches. His eyes are wet. You get the sense he's not here just to clean floors. He's one of them too. James goes back to his notes, not a stack of binders or shiny graphs, but typed pages, hand-marked in pen. Records he had to fight to access. Correspondences he kept. A faded letter of commendation. His original hiring agreement. A memo where someone casually notes, let's ease Holleran out before FY review. And you realize, the only reason this case even made it to court is because James refused to disappear. You want to cheer. But you also want to cry. Because this man had to stand in front of strangers, bare his life, his history, and the medal they once gave him, just to be heard. The defense team, now visibly shaken, tries to pivot. They question his memory, his interpretation of events. The legality of the paperwork. They try to trap him in wording, but James, he's unshakable. Because his mind is a fortress. Because he's not bluffing. And because there's something about fighting through napalm and jungle rot that makes cross-examinations feel like child's play, he answers calmly, even when provoked. He corrects inaccuracies without a flicker of ego. And every time they try to discredit him, he responds with something unshakable, evidence, clarity, or a moment of painful truth. By the end of the day, you can feel the fatigue in the room. Not from James, but from the others. The judge adjourns for the day. But no one really moves. They just sit there, like they've seen a ghost. Outside, as people file out, the janitor walks past James. Doesn't say a word. Just touches his own temple in a quiet salute. James nods, then vanishes into the crowd like he's done his whole life. Quietly. Without asking for recognition. But this time, people remember, by the time James returned for day 2 of the hearing, everything was different, but no one said it out loud. The smirks were gone. The chuckles died in people's throats before they could be born. Even the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had finally decided to respect the man who walked between them. You know the look people give when they've been wrong about someone, like they're trying to erase their first impression with silence. That was the look. James sat at the same table, same posture. The silver star was gone, tucked back into the manila folder, like it had done its job and didn't need to say anything more. But the memory of it still lingered. Humming beneath every word spoken, now came the hard part. The legal team for the defense was ready to play their trump cards, technicalities. They pounced on obscure clauses buried in the Civil Service Code, tried to obscure timelines, and floated legal theories so convoluted they hoped to bury James in them. But here's the thing about someone who survived a war: complexity doesn't scare them. It just makes them more methodical. James took their twisted arguments one by one and unraveled them with brutal, quiet precision. His key weapon wasn't a degree. It was time. Time spent reading every footnote, researching case precedents in the public library, and asking questions in places most people never bother looking. At one point, they brought up a performance review from 5 years ago, one with vague criticisms and conveniently unsigned annotations. Your attendance was marked inconsistent, the lawyer said, holding the document up. James reached into his folder. Pulled out a doctor's note. I had a VA appointment that day. For post-operative recovery from shrapnel removal. Approved leave. Pause, and here, he added, laying down another sheet, is the timestamp from the building's entry log showing I returned to work by 1:42 p.m. The lawyer blinked. You could almost hear the threads of their argument snapping one by one. They tried to discredit the authenticity of the documents. James countered with notarized originals, each stamped and filed from separate departments. Each copy numbered. He'd spent months chasing down proof, writing to agencies who hadn't replied to him in years. Most people would have given up after the second unanswered email. He didn't, because this wasn't just about paperwork. This was about how institutions count on veterans to stay quiet. How they expect men like James to shrug it off, to limp away, to swallow the injustice for the sake of moving on. But James Holleran had learned long ago that silence can be a trap. And he wasn't about to step into one now. In a bold move, the defense called a former supervisor to testify. A man in his mid-50s, sharp suit, smug smile, one of those lifers who stayed just long enough to climb and forget who built the ladder beneath him. He painted James as difficult, outdated, resistant to change. The kind of guy who didn't get modern management. I remember a conversation, the man said. He told me once, I don't work for people who don't work for each other. It sounded insubordinate. James didn't flinch. I said that, he confirmed. After he fired a junior employee for reporting safety violations in the maintenance department. The same violations that caused an elevator malfunction 2 weeks later. Another pause. This one longer. The judge tilted her head. Were these violations documented? Not until after the incident, James replied. I documented them myself. He reached into the folder. Another piece of paper. Another truth brought to light. The cross-examination that followed left the supervisor stammering. Dates didn't match. Claims fell apart. Eventually, the judge had to ask the witness to step down early. Then came a whisper, from the gallery. A woman with gray in her hair and tired hands from decades of civil service. You could tell by the way she sat, back straight, chin up, that she was a lifer too. She stood. Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling but firm. May I speak? I worked with Mr. Holleran for 19 years. The judge hesitated, then nodded, and suddenly, you had the truth, raw and unfiltered. Stories of how James stayed late to help overwhelmed new hires. How he called out safety risks no one else dared mention. How he trained 3 people who got promoted ahead of him, and never once raised his voice in protest. I came today, the woman said, because I heard people were trying to discredit him. And I couldn't live with myself if I let that happen. That's when it hit you, this wasn't a courtroom anymore. This was a reckoning. More people came forward, some in whispers outside the chamber, others in quiet notes slipped to the bailiff. A paper trail began to form, not just of James's integrity, but of a workplace that systematically froze him out. Not through one dramatic event, but through 1,000 small cuts, the defense tried to regain control. They asked the judge to disregard the testimonials as irrelevant to the contract law being disputed, but it was too late. Truth had gained momentum, and through it all, James never raised his voice. Never gloated. Never even smiled, because he wasn't here to win. He was here to stand. To make them remember, not the medal. Not the jungle. Not the past, but the principle. The final day of the hearing began not with a gavel strike, but with an absence. The courtroom filled slowly, the usual shuffling of papers and whispering of strategies replaced by a strange stillness. The defense table sat short. One member, Briggs, the lead counsel, was nowhere to be seen. A junior attorney tried to maintain composure, but his fingers twitched against his notepad. Everyone noticed, but no one said it. Meanwhile, James sat as he always had, straight, silent, and already ready. He didn't need to warm up. Men like him are always in position. The judge glanced at the clock and raised an eyebrow. We'll proceed. Mr. Holleran, are you prepared for final remarks? He stood. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just with the kind of deliberateness that makes people pay attention before he even speaks. I'll keep this short, he said. Because the facts are already here. You've seen the paper trail. You've seen the intent. What's left is the truth. And truth is not complicated. He walked to the center of the courtroom, just 2 steps, but it felt like the distance between worlds. Between who he'd been asked to become after returning from war, and who he had to be now to survive in this one. I served my country. And when I came home, I served again, in a building that didn't require body armor but did require endurance. And I gave that endurance freely. Until someone decided I was too expensive. Too principled. Too inconvenient. He didn't cry. His voice didn't tremble, and that's why it hit so hard. I'm not asking for a parade. I'm not asking for a reward. I'm asking for the promise to be honored. The same promise I kept when I was told to go. The same one I kept when I didn't come home in one piece. Then he reached into the manila folder one last time. This time, it wasn't a medal, it was a letter. Signed. Old. Typed on paper so thin you could see the yellow in it. He read from it slowly. We value your continued service to this country, both in and out of uniform. Your commitment will not go unnoticed. He looked up. Well, it did. A full second of silence followed before the judge finally nodded. Thank you, Mr. Holleran. Please be seated. Now came the final defense statement, but it was different. The lawyer didn't look confident anymore. His voice wavered as he tried to cling to policies, revisions, gray areas in contract law. But you could tell his heart wasn't in it. He wasn't defending a position anymore. He was defending retreat, because there comes a point when truth steamrolls argument. When the weight of lived experience can't be outmaneuvered by clever language. And this courtroom had crossed that line. The judge called a short recess to deliberate. James stepped outside into the corridor, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above him. The janitor was there again. Still silent. But this time, he stepped forward and spoke. I was with the 173rd, Afghanistan. Kunar province, he said. I know what they do to guys like us when the uniform comes off. James nodded. No thanks. No handshake. Just a deep, soul-level understanding. Then a surprise, a younger man in a business suit approached, one of the courtroom observers who had watched everything from the back. He was trembling slightly. My dad, he died before I really understood who he was. He served. Bronze Star. I think he went through what you did. But he didn't talk about it. I just wanted to say thank you. James simply looked him in the eye. Then you remember him. That's enough. Back inside, the judge returned. People straightened in their seats. The lawyers did their last-minute fiddling with folders and glasses. But James? James just waited. The judge began reading the decision. Slowly. Carefully. Legal language, yes, but with an edge of reverence that hadn't been there before. The court found in favor of Mr. Holleran. All benefits were to be restored retroactively. Back pay awarded. Public correction of the employment record. And, in a rare and stunning inclusion, a formal acknowledgement of wrongful treatment attached to the final judgment. You'd think there would be applause. But there wasn't, because this wasn't a movie, this was dignity being returned. James gave the slightest nod. Not of satisfaction, but of completion. And in that moment, you saw the real power of justice, not when it's served with drama, but when it's earned through silent, steady truth. As people filed out, they looked at him differently. Not like a hero, but like a man. A whole man. One who refused to be edited out of his own story. Outside the courthouse, the sky had clouded. Rain threatened but held back. James paused on the steps. Looked out across the street to a flag hanging limp on a pole, catching just enough wind to ripple. He didn't salute it. He didn't need to. He had already done enough. Behind him, the young man, maybe 25, still holding that invisible thread between his father's memory and the courtroom truth, called out. Mr. Holleran. What do we do now? James turned. Now. He said, you pay attention. You remember. And if it happens again, you stand. Then he walked away, manila folder tucked under his arm. Still sealed. Still whole. The storm waited until James was halfway down the courthouse steps before releasing its first raindrop, sharp, cold, honest. Not dramatic. Just real. Like everything about this story, he didn't flinch. Didn't rush for cover. Just kept walking, the rain soaking slowly through his collar, streaking down the lines of his face. And you realized something then. Some people have been wet for decades before the clouds even break. James didn't go home that afternoon. Not directly. He went to a cemetery. It was a quiet place, just outside town, where the grass grew taller than it should and the headstones had no visitors on weekdays. He stopped at a small granite marker with a name carved in tight military font, David Ark of Encott. No dates. No rank. Just that name, and a single rusted flag holder driven into the soil beside it. He stood there in silence for a long time. Long enough for the rain to soften the dirt and soak the cuffs of his slacks. And when he finally spoke, it was like a whisper across time. They tried, Dave. They really tried. And then, after another pause, but I remembered. You see, David had been one of the wounded men James had dragged out of that ravine in Quang Tri. He'd made it home. Got a job in procurement. Same department James ended up in later. But David didn't have the fight left in him. When they cornered him, boxed him into early retirement. Whispered about mental instability, suggested he was too rigid for team culture. He didn't have James's fire. He died in anonymity. Heart failure, they said. But James always believed it was the kind of heartbreak you can't diagnose. That's why James had never let go. Not entirely. Because this wasn't just his story. It was Dave's. It was every veteran who had ever traded battlefields for back offices and got punished for it. That night, back in his apartment, James didn't celebrate. He didn't open champagne or call anyone. He didn't even own a smartphone. He sat down at his old desk, turned on the lamp, and pulled out an envelope addressed to the Office of Personnel Management. Inside was a copy of the judgment. A short letter. And one line handwritten in ink, the system isn't the enemy. Forgetting is. He sealed it. Stamped it. And left it by the door. The next morning, the newspaper headline didn't mention his name. The local station ran a short piece, 2 minutes, buried between sports scores and weather. But a clip made its way online. James standing tall. The medal. The folder. His quiet power. And that's when the floodgates opened. A woman in New Mexico posted, "My father was silenced too. I never understood why. Thank you, Mr. Holleran." A man in Michigan shared, "Same thing happened to me in '88. They called me too old school. I thought I was the only one. Hundreds. Then thousands. Not outrage. Not anger. Just stories. Fragments. Truths that had been hidden too long. People connecting, remembering, rebuilding something invisible. One of the courtroom observers started a project, the Holleran Archive. A digital collection of testimonies from veterans who had faced institutional erosion. It wasn't flashy. But it was real. And it grew faster than anyone expected. James didn't manage the project. He didn't even contribute to it directly, he just watched, and every now and then, he'd write a letter. No return address. No signature. Just typed words on real paper. One simply read, "Don't chase medals. Chase meaning." Another, "What's legal isn't always what's right. But sometimes, it can be." And the most recent one, "They laughed at me once. Now they listen." That's not victory. That's memory waking up. That's the thing, isn't it? James Holleran didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a man who did not let time, or bureaucracy, or laziness erase the truth, and in doing so, he became something more. Not because he sought it, but because he carried it, and now, long after the trial, long after the courtroom emptied and the papers yellowed, people still tell his story. Not the war part. Not the silver star, but the courtroom part, because that's where he stood, not as a soldier, but as a citizen. And maybe that's the hardest thing to be after you've worn the uniform, someone who still believes in the promises you once fought for. Not everyone gets that chance, but James did. And so did we. You can feel it now, the quiet in your chest, the gentle stillness that settles in when a story ends, not with fireworks, but with something firmer. Like truth, let it sit with you for a moment. Imagine James walking back into his modest apartment, no parade waiting for him, no cameras, no speeches. Just the click of a door closing, the warmth of an old lamp, and the steady hum of silence. Outside, the storm has passed. The sidewalks glisten under streetlights, and in that sheen, there's reflection, not just of puddles, but of the paths we take when no one's watching. Because maybe that's the real message here, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just keeps showing up. Day after day. Document after document. Wrong after wrong, and kindness. It hides in those quiet acts. The janitor's salute. The colleague's testimony. The letter slipped into a folder decades ago, finally read aloud in the room that tried to forget it. You don't have to wear a uniform to carry that kind of courage. You just have to stand when it's easier to sit. Speak when silence is safer. Remember when forgetting would be more convenient, and maybe next time you see someone who seems invisible, older, quieter, overlooked, you'll think twice. You'll wonder what medals lie hidden in their drawers. What wars they still fight in silence, what promises they're still holding someone accountable for. So take a deep breath. Let it all sink in, and as you settle back into your evening, wherever you are, whatever time it is, know this: you just stood in a courtroom with a man who made history not with a gun, but with truth, and you remembered.